In terms of implementation in the field, a very important thing, as I mentioned this morning already, and there are certain presentations now coming up. And the first one is, what about the soil in the NDCs of countries in the front of the UNFCCC? As you may know, the NDCs have to be sent to UNFCCC until end of 2020, if not already done so. And Mrs. Liesl WIESE-ROZANOVA will present something on the NDCs. Ah, there she is. Okay, the floor is open to you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Good afternoon, everyone. I think there's been quite a good introduction for this talk, also by by Cornelia in the previous presentation, so I will get right into it. But saying that it's actually about soil organic carbon in the nationally determined contributions, specifically under the agricultural sector. So there are a lot of scientific studies looking at what the actual carbon sequestration potential in agricultural lands are, as well as the extent of peatlands, organic soils, and the potential to preserve carbon in organic rich soils. So this is just an example from 2 publications showing the top 10 countries with the highest potential to sequester carbon under croplands in mineral soils, which is the yellowish brown, or to protect carbon in organic soils, which are the red ones, or with the highest potential to do both, which you can see really looks at the shows the countries with the highest area and often the highest agricultural area as a result, which plays a big role in carbon sequestration potential, and along with climate and soil type and so on. So we looked at the nationally determined contributions submitted until 17 October this year to see, based on a keyword search for words like soil carbon, organic carbon, carbon, etc., to see whether nationally determined contributions at the moment address soil carbon. And we found that out of the 184 NDCs mentioned on the NDC website, only 10 specify soil carbon in some form related to a mitigation target. And another 3 countries mention soil organic carbon somehow in the text, but without clearly linking it to a target. We also looked at some of the management practices that are well known to sequester or protect carbon, and many of these have been mentioned in the presentations until now, with the understanding or thinking that perhaps countries don't necessarily specify soil carbon in relation to their targets, but they might specify practice that would, by implication, protect or increase soil organic carbon, as an indication of how we can move from here and where the potential is for increased targets, should countries want to do so. So agroforestry, silvopastoralism, for example, is listed in 31 NDCs, grassland and pasture management in 13 countries' NDCs, and so on. So to give you an indication or an example of how countries actually address carbon in the NDCs, I will show you the extent in decreasing level of detail according to the numbers. So the most detailed one that we found was actually in Namibia, which mentions a number of measures under the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. It mentions measures in terms of implementation, and then it also mentions measures in terms of quantitative targets, including a measure soil organic carbon of 0.18 megatons CO2 until 2030. Then we have, for example, it doesn't show the top part, but this is a sectoral sub-target. So under the agricultural sector, there would be a sub-target, for example, in Japan, for crop and grazing management of 7.9 megatons CO2. And soil organic carbon would be included in that along with other measures. And then there's also Uruguay, who didn't mention specific quantitative values, but rather indicated the percentage area of land under which carbon is to be protected or sequestered. Another one is non-sectoral sub-targets, for example, Canada. So under this target of 44 megatons is included carbon protection in forests, wetlands, and I think, not sure what the other one was, but there's also energy efficient transport and things like that. So it's a few different sectors. Then we have a sectoral target in the case of Malawi, for example, but an important point that developing countries is also using is to specify conditional targets, depending on the need for financial, technical, or other support. And the Paris Agreement states specifically under Article 4 that developing countries should be supported in order to increase their ambition and communicate and report on progress on the Paris Agreement. And finally, there are also overall economy-wide national targets, which includes measures specified under agriculture that relate to soil organic carbon. So based on how the Paris Agreement is formulated and the differences that are occurring in terms of how countries are planning their agricultural management in terms of carbon protection and sequestration, and what is reflected in the nationally determined contributions, we see the NDCs as an opportunity to align what is reflected in terms of ambition and transparency in the NDCs and the national processes that are happening, which are perhaps unseen. And in this balanced case, we conducted interviews with 8 countries to understand a little bit more about the processes and why carbon was reflected in the NDCs or not. So in the case of Japan, there is the target which includes soil organic carbon, and through an interview and looking at the literature, we understood that in Japan, soils are considered essential for agriculture. So since 1997, there has been a national soil monitoring program. They are measuring soil carbon amongst other things. They are measuring management practices through interviews or questionnaires. And they were able to use IPCC Tier 3 approach methods to calculate their emission targets. They are considered achievable and realistic. And they also developed the plan for global warming countermeasures in 2017, which includes agricultural soil sinks through things like compost and green manure. There are subsidies, for example, for composting, and there is, again, a specific target linked to all of this. On the other hand, this might be quite interesting. We also conducted an interview with an expert involved in the United States. Despite the United States' current position in terms of the Paris Agreement, we wanted to understand what was happening back in 2014-15 when the intended nationally determined contributions were developed, since it's well known that the US has quite a lot of capacity in terms of soil carbon. So the intended nationally determined contribution for the United States shows an economy-wide target, and the Paris Agreement states that developed countries, have to show economy-wide targets. And there's no specification of sectors or carbon specifically. But at the same time, in the States, they developed the USDA building blocks for climate-smart agriculture and forestry as a guide to support land users in addressing climate change. And under this, a number of actions and measures are specified, which includes soil carbon sequestration under the theme of soil health, stating that it can sequester between 4 and 18 megatons carbon dioxide equivalents per year. I think this was until 2025. Also protection of wetland areas. So to conclude, there are a lot of intricacies, and through other interviews we really understood that countries have different views and perspectives in terms of prioritizing carbon, soil organic carbon protection or sequestration, also in terms of food security and crop production and general ecosystem health and services. So there are two ways to view this. The first is from the global perspective in terms of mitigation, transparency, and tracking. And in that sense, we see that most countries do not explicitly express soil carbon in relation to their targets in the NDCs. And this may be due to the sectoral or economy-wide targets that they don't need to specify it, or it can be based on the inability to enforce specific targets or challenges with measuring and monitoring and calculating mitigation potentials and targets. So the way that NDCs are now, in terms of transparency and tracking of soil carbon sequestration and protection, the NDCs are not a good indicator of national ambition or action. In terms of the way forward, with the second round of NDCs, which countries are required to submit every 5 years, and the Paris Agreement actually requires that ambition is increased every 5 years. Based on this analysis, we feel that it's still a country prerogative to include or specify carbon in the NDCs or not, based on national priorities. And they may choose to do so for various reasons, including showing transparency, demonstrating capacity or leadership in the field of carbon sequestration and protection, and also measurement and monitoring, or to leverage support, especially for developing countries, as stated in the Paris Agreement. So in the next round of NDCs, there are many ways in which countries could better reflect their carbon ambition and actions. There are a number of examples of how to do that in detail, but as a minimum, if countries want to express interest without setting too high targets to be met, they can, for example, increase specificity by breaking economy-wide targets down to sectoral targets, and within sectoral targets such as agriculture, specify measures, for example, stating, I think it's Malawi that says, for example, agroforestry will be implemented, which will support soil organic carbon sequestration. So the measures and the implication of carbon protection or sequestration can be measured. That already picks it up as an interest. And at a next level to that, the last point, the relative contribution that soil carbon protection or sequestration can make to the sectoral target can be stated as a relative percentage to show a relative indication. And this work we are currently writing up as a peer-reviewed paper, which we hope to submit early in the next year. And I want to thank Vanguard Charitable for the funding and the collaborators. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liesl, for that insight into the NDC world, or let's better say, the NDCs of the world. And at least in my eyes, these NDCs, they are mainly the link between science and policy decisions. And for the future, I think there is something to do for all of us, as mentioned, but that's also, well, question of measuring, as I mentioned already. If you're able to measure something, then it's easier to put it into an NDC and to relate national goals to that.